Hello, and welcome to this presentation of Oracle 11G PL/SQL Programming Part 2, Trigger Basics. My name is Mary Gable, and I will be your instructor. If at any time you have any questions or comments, please use our question and comment box that you find located here at the bottom of the page. Now, let's get started. Topics for this module include basically how to implement triggers. I'm going to define triggers, talk about what they are, all the different characteristics of database triggers. Now, to define it, a trigger is an event-driven PL/SQL procedure which is executed or fired automatically at runtime. Okay. The previous PL/SQL code that we've seen only executes when it's called by name. A trigger is event-driven. Because it's event-driven, it's going to execute on behalf of an insert, an update, or a delete event when it occurs on a specific table for which the trigger is defined. That's what we call a DML trigger, and those are the most common types of triggers that we would have in our database. Now again, they're similar to stored procedures in that they have a name. They're stored in the database. Of course, they get all the same database advantages of being backed up and so forth as all your other stored procedures and functions. They differ because they execute implicitly. Okay, so it's an automatic, under the covers, behind the scene kind of thing that happens. The triggering event occurs, and if there's a trigger associated with the event that occurred, then it will automatically execute. Now, besides DML triggers, there are also system event triggers on events like login and shutdown. Those are more like DBA style triggers, and they're covered in other courses. Since triggers are not called, they may not accept any parameters. Again, they're intended to execute based upon the fact that an event has occurred. Now, triggers can be used to basically automate just about any task that you're looking to automate. Now, some examples might be, first of all, complex security checking. If it's not just as easy as either I'm going to give somebody a privilege on my object or not, maybe you need to check and see what time of day it is and what contracts you're currently working on. And, you might have a lot of things to query and check before you decide to let this person get access to your data. That can all be done through triggers. Also, true relational database theorists tell us that we should never store derived data. Okay, an excellent simple example of derived data. In our item table, we have a column called quantity, and we have a column called price. And as you might expect, in order to get a line item total, we're going to multiply quantity times price. That's an example of derived data. And again, we're told that we should not store that in our database, but rather calculate it each time. And that's great, except sometimes we need faster access to that piece of information. Calculating it sometimes becomes an unreasonable use of your resources. So we oftentimes, as we design applications, sort of break the rules and sometimes store derived data. If you have, the easiest way for you to make sure that it stays current and that it's always valid is to write a trigger that says, anytime I change any of the inputs to this derived data, I want to recalculate it. You can also use it for very complex auditing and logging, Oftentimes we want to create history records of things. So we're going to let someone delete a row from a table, but we're really going to take that row that they've deleted and kind of under the covers, put it in some history table somewhere. Very common thing to do with triggers. You can also use them to define any kind of complex integrity constraints. Again, sort of similar to the security checking that we were talking about. Now, when you create a trigger, you basically have 4 different parts, and really one of the parts has 2 characteristics. So there's really 5 characteristics of a trigger that you would need to consider. The first part is what we call the trigger type. And a trigger type can either be before or it can be after. Now remember, the trigger is designed to execute based on an event. So when you write your trigger, you're going to specifically say whether or not you want this code to execute before the event or after the event. Also part of the trigger type is this concept of statement level versus row level. Okay. And the idea here is that, let's say that we have an update statement. It's going to update all the employees in Department 10. Okay. Now, let's assume also that we have a trigger defined on the update event for the employee table. Now, if I have a trigger that's a statement level trigger, and I issue the event update imp and change all the employee records where the department number equals 10, if I want my code to execute once on behalf of that statement, then I write what we call a statement level trigger. I might, however, not just want to run it once for the statement. I also have an opportunity to execute my code once for every row that's being processed by the trigger. And in row level triggers, I can actually see and manipulate the values of the individual columns in that row. Another characteristic of a trigger is the event for which it is created on. Okay, and the event is either going to be a DML event, which is insert, update, or delete, or we do have those database level events like shutdown, startup that we talked about, and pretty much outside the scope of this. Another part of your trigger, this is actually an optional part of the trigger, you have the ability to place a restriction on your trigger. And this is an interesting concept because triggers are going to fire based on events. And if your code is intended to do something only under certain conditions when that event occurs, not every single time, but only when the event occurs and something else occurs, that's where you can write a trigger restriction that says only execute this trigger when this is true. You do that with a when clause that you will include when you create your trigger. And finally, your trigger has a PL SQL block that's associated with it, right? You're trying to do something with this trigger. Okay, so whatever logic you're trying to perform, are you trying to see what time it is and tell the user that they can't modify your table during this time of day? Or are you trying to take the quantity and the price and multiplying it together and putting it back in a total line item value? You know, whatever it is, whatever the purpose of this trigger is, that's what you're going to code in the block. Now, one thing about triggers is that triggers are apt to cause other triggers to fire. And what I mean by that is, let's say table A has a trigger on it that when I delete a record from A, it inserts a record into B. Basically takes that old record that I'm getting out of A and it's doing an insert and inserting that into B. Now let's assume that B has a trigger on it whose event is the insert event. So by making that one change or by making that one delete on the initial row, my trigger, because of what it does, the trigger action itself can perform DML. So if the trigger action performs DML on an event for which there is another trigger defined, you could potentially have have a lot of triggers firing other triggers. So just be aware of that and be careful with exactly what you're doing. You only want to use them when you really need to and to automate specific processes. Now let's take a look at an example. We're going to be seeing an example of a trigger that's going to fire whenever the Sal column or the manager column in the employee table are updated. You're also going to fire it whenever you insert a row. It's going to need to be a row level trigger. And in a row level trigger, we're going to be able to reference the column values of the row and actually modify their values in the body of our trigger. This particular example, we want to only modify or only have our trigger execute if the new value of the salary is greater than 3,000. We also want this trigger to fire whenever a row is inserted into the table. And the purpose of the trigger, here's the real deal here. We want to make sure, let's say we have a rule in our human resources department that says, if you make more than $3,000 as your salary, you are required to report directly to the president. So I can write a trigger that will verify that. It'll make sure every time I insert a new record into the table, it'll check that salary. If the salary is greater than 3,000, regardless of what I'm trying to use for the manager number, I want my trigger to intercept that and to use the number 7839 instead. Okay? So there's some of the criteria of this particular trigger. So let's take a look at what this might look like. So we have a command, create or replace trigger. It has a name. It's called assign manager. It is a before trigger versus an after trigger. The event that it's being defined on is the insert event or the update event at the column level, only if I update either the salary or the manager. And the trigger is being created on the employee table. Now next you'll notice we have the keywords for each row. Okay, that's how we indicate that we want this particular trigger to be a row level trigger. Otherwise, statement level is really the default. So you could, if it was a statement level trigger, you could eliminate line 3 altogether. Now another thing we said is, you know what, if the salary is not greater than 3,000, then we don't need to be concerned about this. I'm only concerned with employees whose salary is greater than 3,000. And of course their salary might have been $2,500 before, and we're updating it to $3,500. So as part of updating their salary from $2,500 to $3,500, this trigger is going to execute, and it's also going to assign a specific manager number to their manager column. So there's a couple of lines of code here that's referencing columns from the current row. First of all, line 4. This is what we call our trigger restriction. It's a when clause that's placed at the sort of the header of the trigger, and it has a Boolean condition. That when clause evaluates the Boolean condition and then only continues with the rest of the block if that condition is true. So again, for us in this situation, if your salary is less than $3,000, then I'm going to leave you being assigned to whatever manager you're currently assigned to. Once your salary goes over $3,000, or even if I'm inserting a brand new employee whose salary is greater than $3,000, this trigger is going to fire. And what it's going to do is it's simply going to take :new.manager. That's the way we refer to the current row. We basically have what we call new values and we have old values. New values are valid on inserts and updates, and old values are valid on updates and deletes. So our when clause says only when new.sal greater than 3,000, so only when the current salary for the current row for which this trigger is firing is greater than 3,000, then I'm simply going to assign this manager number to the manager field. I end the create trigger command, I execute it, and I get my message indicating that my trigger was created. Now, just like stored procedures and functions, by creating the trigger, what you're doing is you're parsing it and loading both the parsed form and the source code into the data dictionary. You're not actually executing the code. Okay? With triggers, they're event-based. So the way that this code is going to execute is by having someone insert a record into the emp table, or by having some session update the salary or the manager column. And remember, it's only going to fire if that salary value is greater than 3,000. Okay. Here's another example of another trigger. This trigger is very simply saying, you know what? $4,000 is the maximum salary that we're going to be paying anybody. So I want to write a trigger that just says if anybody's salary tries to bump up above $4,000, then I want to stop that DML statement, whatever it is, whether it's an insert or an update. I actually want to stop the DML, give them a message, and raise an exception. So here's the code that'll do that for us. We say create or replace trigger. The name of this trigger is called not too much sal. It is a before trigger because we want it to fire before the event. The event that it's defined upon is the insert event, or if we update the salary, the table that the trigger is being declared on is the emp table. And it is row level. Now, it's important to understand that the reason why it has to be row level is because we want to reference the individual rows' values. Okay? So we simply say if new.sal greater than 4,000, then we're going to use our raise application error procedure. We've seen this previously in part 1 when we looked at exception handling. So basically, we've decided the salary you're trying to use is too big. So I'm going to send you a message using raise application error. I'm going to use an appropriate error number here that's between 20,000 and 20,999 negative. And I'm simply going to say the salary must be less than 4,000. I end the if. I end the create trigger command. And one more example. let's assume that, and this is also using some tables that we don't have as sample tables, but again, a very good example and a very simple one to understand. Let's assume that we have, we're keeping track of some inventory. So we have a table called inventory, and in that inventory table, we have a part ID, we have a quantity on hand, we have a lowest quantity, a reorder quantity, and a reorder flag. So basically the idea is that we keep track of all of our parts and how many we have on hand. Once our quantity on hand falls below our lowest quantity, what we want to do is we want to set up an automatic order. Okay? And our reorder quantity will tell us whether or not, will tell us how many to order. And the flag will tell us whether or not we really want to reorder any of these parts. Now, so we have an inventory table, and we're assuming that we have some application that's depleting the quantity. Now, our trigger is intended to set up an automatic order. So, besides this inventory table, we're also going to assume that we have a table called orders, and that table has an order ID. It has a part ID, it has a reorder quantity, and a transaction date. So let's look at an example of the code that would take that situation when the quantity falls beneath our threshold. We want to automatically insert a row into the orders table to set up, maybe we're going to, at the end of every day, we go into that orders table and we actually place orders for everything whose quantity was depleted during the day. So we say create or replace trigger. It's called create order. It's an after level trigger. The other ones we saw were before triggers because we were trying to keep something from happening. On this, we're going to let it happen and we're just going to kind of go behind it and do something else. Okay, so it is an after trigger. It's going to execute after the event update of quantity on hand. So it's important to understand that when you define the event to be update, that you can also define specific columns, just like we did before. If you updated somebody's address, I wasn't concerned about whose manager you were reporting to. Okay. Same thing here. If you update the reorder quantity, I don't care. I'm only going to need to check this when the quantity on hand is being updated. I do have my keywords for each row because, again, this is a row level trigger because I need to get to the individual column values. I also have a trigger restriction here. Remember we said we had a reorder flag? It's just a way of potentially not reordering parts that you weren't happy with. So you can go in and for any parts that you have, you can set the reorder flag to false and it won't automatically set up this order. So the idea is that before I set up the new order, I want to check the reorder flag. And I want to do this only if the reorder flag is set to true. Next, I have the begin that begins the block. I simply have an if statement here. If, colon, and I do want you to notice, sometimes people think this is a typo. It's not. When you refer to a column value from the current row in the when clause, you do not use a colon. However, when you refer to it in the body of the block, you do use a colon. So that is not a typo, that's just the required syntax. So I simply say, if colon new dot quantity on hand is less than colon new dot lowest quantity, remember that's my threshold. So if I've gotten beneath my threshold, then I'm simply going to insert a row into my orders table. I'm going to be using a sequence number for that order ID. I'm going to be using the current part number from my row because I want to order the current part. So I get colon new dot part ID. I also get colon new dot reorder quantity. And then there was a transaction date that we're also filling in. I'm simply using the variable sysdate to mean today's date. I end the if, end the create trigger command, execute the create trigger command. And what this trigger, once it's created and enabled, it will automatically, every time I update quantity on hand, check and see if it's a reorderable part. If it is a reorderable part, it's going to see if the quantity on hand has gotten to be less than our lowest quantity threshold. And if so, it's going to automatically generate an order in the orders table. So we looked at several examples of where you might want to use triggers and how you might want to use triggers. It's really one of those open-ended kind of things, like you could write a program to do just about anything. You could also write a trigger to do just about anything. Do you have questions? If so, don't forget about our question and comment box that you find located at the bottom of the page. Thanks so much for joining me here today at gogotraining.com. And I look forward to seeing you right back here in future modules.